The restaurant glowed like a jewelry box, left open in the middle of the city, every surface catching reflections of Christmas lights and polished glass. Soft carols floated above the low murmur of rich laughter, the clink of crystal, the sigh of waiters' shoes sliding over marble. Clara moved between the tables with automatic grace, a tray balanced on her shoulder, the muscles doing what her tired mind no longer needed to command. Her hair was tied back too tight, her feet ached inside worn black shoes, and the scent of roast turkey and expensive perfume wrapped around her like a heavy, invisible curtain. Somewhere, a child laughed near the giant tree, and for a heartbeat she remembered another Christmas tree made of cardboard and blinking mismatched lights. She straightened her red shirt, glanced at the handwritten order slip, and aimed her steps toward the corner table reserved for Mr. Hale, party of 4. To her, it was just another name on the reservation list, another suit who could tip well or badly, depending on whether the wine arrived fast enough. As she approached, she saw him sitting there already, alone for the moment, a navy suit fitting his shoulders like it had been tailored for a photograph. His expression was calm, practiced, the kind of face that spent its life being listened to. The candle in the center of the table flickered against his features, softening the sharpness that might otherwise have seemed cruel. Clara exhaled quietly and let the professional smile settle over her own features like a mask. "Good evening, sir, and Merry Christmas," she said, sliding the menu toward him with steady hands, offering the same warmth she offered strangers every night. He nodded without looking up right away, eyes still on the phone in his hand, thumb scrolling through messages that seemed more urgent than her presence. When he finally lifted his gaze, there was a quick, efficient sweep over her name tag, her uniform, her hair as if checking a box in his mind. His voice, when he ordered the Christmas special and the most expensive wine on the list, was smooth and precise, the tone of a man used to doors opening before he reached them. Clara wrote it all down, pretending not to notice the way her own reflection wavered in the silver of his watch. To him, she knew, she was barely more than part of the decor. The evening rolled on in waves of orders and laughter, and the ache in her feet grew into a dull, familiar fire. By the time his table was ready for the check, the restaurant felt like a snow globe someone had shaken too hard. Glittering, crowded, everyone caught in their own swirling little dramas. Clara printed the bill, slid it into the leather folder, and crossed the room once more, carefully weaving between chairs and handbags that cost more than her month's rent. As she reached his table, his companions were laughing at some quiet joke, their faces rosy from wine and comfort, the world outside the windows nothing but a blur of cold night and distant headlights. She placed the folder on the white tablecloth, her hand steady, her smile automatic. And then she saw it. On his left hand, where the candlelight burned the brightest, a ring caught the flicker and returned it with a soft golden blaze. Her breath snagged in her chest. The room, for her, went silent, every sound falling away like someone had turned down the volume of the world. The engraving, tiny leaves curling around a central line, the worn edge where time had smoothed the metal, the delicate curve of the band. It was not just similar, it was identical to the ring her mother had described 100 times. Before her mind could shout caution, her body leaned slightly forward, finger trembling as it pointed, and the words slipped out in a fragile, unbelieving breath. "My mom had a ring just like this." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Victor Hale's hand froze above the check, the ring still catching the candlelight like a small, unblinking eye. His companions turned toward Clara, their laughter trailing off in mid-air, expressions slipping from amusement to confusion. Clara felt her face flush hot, the words still hanging between them, fragile as glass. She opened her mouth to apologize, to soften what she'd said, but the apology never found its way out. Instead, she watched his eyes narrow, something dark and offended tightening behind the polite mask. "I beg your pardon," he said at last, his voice low but edged with steel, as if she had just insulted him in a boardroom full of executives. Clara swallowed, suddenly aware of how close her hand still was to his, how small her finger looked pointing at that ring. My mum had a ring that looked like this," she murmured, pulling her hand back, trying to sound casual, harmless. One of the women at the table shifted uncomfortably, glancing between them. Victor straightened his shoulders, as if rising to a challenge only he could see. "That's impossible," he replied, the word landing like a slap. "This ring has been in my family for years. Perhaps your mother saw it somewhere she shouldn't have." The implication spilled into the air before anyone could pretend not to hear it. Clara's stomach twisted, heat burning in her cheeks and chest, but she stood frozen, pinned by his gaze. "We don't pay you to comment on personal property," he added, louder now, so nearby tables began to look over. "Get your manager. I will not be spoken to like this by staff inventing stories." The manager arrived in a flurry of whispers and apologies, bowing his head, promising a discount, a free dessert, anything to smooth the surface back to shiny calm. Clara stood slightly behind him, feeling smaller and smaller as Victor described her intrusive remarks, his tone painting her as nosy, unprofessional, even unstable. Each word shrank her uniform, her name tag, her entire life into something flimsy and embarrassing. She tried to explain, stammering that it was just a comment, just a resemblance, but her voice melted under the weight of his certainty. In the end, the manager asked her to step away, using that careful, tight smile reserved for problems he intended to remove from sight. She walked back toward the service corridor, the sounds of the restaurant swelling and then receding like waves crashing behind a closed door. In the narrow hallway, surrounded by stacked crates and the smell of detergent, she leaned her back against the cool wall and finally let her head drop forward. Her hands were still shaking, her throat tight with words that had nowhere to go. Maybe it was a coincidence, she thought. Maybe grief had tricked her eyes and turned any ring into that ring. Yet beneath the sharp sting of humiliation, another feeling pulsed quietly, stubborn as a heartbeat. The look in his eyes when she mentioned her mother had not been mere annoyance, but fear, as if she had touched something that should never have been named. The cold outside hit her like a second punishment when her shift finally ended, hours after the incident, the city wrapped in a thin veil of mist and Christmas lights. Clara pulled her coat tight around her uniform and stepped into the night, her breath rising in small clouds as she walked toward the bus stop. Behind her, the restaurant glowed warm and golden, a world she had just been pushed to the edges of. With every step, the scene replayed in her mind. The gleam of the ring, his voice growing louder, the manager's forced smile. She told herself to forget it, to chalk it up to exhaustion and holiday stress, but the image of the ring clung to her thoughts like a burr. It wasn't just similar, it was exact. On the bus, she found an empty seat by the window and let her forehead rest against the cold glass, watching the city slide past in blurry ribbons of red and green. The Christmas decorations outside triggered memories she had carefully folded away, her father lifting her up with strong, calloused hands so she could hang a crooked paper star on a tiny, artificial tree. Their apartment had always smelled of dust, coffee, and something warm from the oven when her mother could afford it. They had never had real crystal or fine china, but they had music from an old radio and her father's laugh echoing against the thin walls. And on her mother's hand, shining more brightly than anything else in the room, there had always been that simple gold ring with the delicate leaf engraving. She remembered the way her mother would twist the ring slowly whenever she spoke about her husband after the accident, the word always dropping heavily as if it didn't quite fit. The company said it was nobody's fault, just bad luck on a bad day. But even as a child, Clara had felt something off in the way grown-ups tried to avoid her eyes when they talked about it. When the medical bills and debts began to pile up, the ring became both a comfort and a looming question. How long could they keep it, and what would it cost to let it go? The day her mother returned from the pawnshop, her hand was bare for the first time, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow, in a way that frightened Clara more than any bill ever could. Later that night, alone in her small present-day apartment, Clara kicked off her shoes and stood a moment in the quiet, the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a television next door, the only signs of life. She felt too restless to sleep, so she pulled an old cardboard box from the back of the closet, the one she hadn't opened in years. Inside lay a handful of photos, folded documents, and the faint smell of dust and old paper. She sat on the worn couch, spreading everything carefully on the coffee table, as if laying out pieces of a puzzle she had once known by heart. Her fingers lingered on a picture of her parents, younger, smiling in the weak sun of a construction site. In that photo, her father stood in a hard hat, one arm slung around her mother's shoulders, the other extended in a handshake with a man in a crisp suit. The man was younger, his hair darker, but the features were unmistakable. Victor Hale, smiling at the camera, the future billionaire already radiating certainty. Clara's eyes were drawn not to his face, however, but to his left hand. The finger that now carried the ring was bare, no band, no engraving catching the light. Her breath caught as the air in the room seemed to thin around her. If the ring had been her mother's, until the day it was pawned, and this photo showed him without it, then there was only one question left pulsing in her mind, sharp and insistent. How had her father's ring travelled from that pawnshop into the hand of the man who had just called her mother a thief in front of the world? The next morning, the restaurant felt different the moment Clara stepped through the staff entrance, her badge beeping faintly against the scanner. The usual chatter near the lockers was quieter, eyes sliding away from hers a little too fast. Someone muttered something about the incident under their breath, and another waiter gave her an apologetic, helpless shrug. Before she could tie her apron, the manager appeared at the doorway, his jaw tight, and asked her to come to his office for a moment. The way he said it told her this moment would not be small. The office was cramped, the blinds half-closed against the pale winter light, making the room feel like a box within a box. Her manager sat behind the desk, fiddling with a pen, but it was the other man who drew her attention. A stranger in a dark, perfectly pressed suit, a leather briefcase at his feet. He rose halfway as she entered, gave her a professional nod, and introduced himself as a representative of Hale Consolidated, speaking her name as if reading it from an invisible file. Clara sat when they gestured, feeling the air grow heavier around her shoulders. The door clicked shut behind her with a small, final sound. The lawyer's voice was smooth, almost gentle, as he recounted the previous night's events, like items on a list. The comment about the ring, the inappropriate insinuation, the discomfort it caused Mr. Hale and his guests. He emphasized certain phrases: defamation, unfounded accusation, damage to reputation, each one landing with more weight than the last. Clara tried to explain that she hadn't meant to accuse anyone, that she had simply recognized the design of the ring, but her words sounded thin and small in the air between them. The manager avoided her eyes, pretending to study a stack of schedules on his desk, as if he were just an observer and not part of the pressure closing in around her. Then the lawyer slid a single sheet of paper across the desk, turning it so it faced her. The document was short, full of carefully arranged sentences stating that she had misinterpreted what she saw, that her comment had been a product of fatigue and imagination, and that she recognized Mr. Hale's ring as a family heirloom unrelated to her own family in any way. Signing, he explained, would put the matter to rest and ensure there were no grounds for further action. His smile did not reach his eyes, and beneath the polished courtesy she could feel the blade, the unspoken warning that people who caused trouble for men like Victor Hale rarely kept their jobs. Clara stared at the paper, the black ink blurring for a moment as her heart thudded in her ears. To sign would be to admit officially that her mother's story was a fantasy, that the ring had nothing to do with them, that last night's spark of recognition was just a tired girl's mistake. She thought of the photo on her coffee table, of her father's bare hand, of her mother's empty finger after the pawnshop. Slowly, she pushed the paper back across the desk, her hand trembling, but her voice steady. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "but I can't sign something that says my memory is a lie." For a long second, no one spoke, and in that silence she felt for the first time the full height of the wall she had just chosen to stand against. For a few seconds after her refusal, the room stayed painfully still, as if even the humming light above them were holding its breath. The lawyer's polite expression cooled by a few degrees, the corners of his mouth tightening almost imperceptibly. He collected the unsigned paper with a small, controlled movement and slipped it back into his folder, the soft click of the metal clasp sounding louder than it should. "That is, of course, your choice," he said, his tone now entirely professional, entirely distant. "But choices have consequences, Miss Alvarez." Hermanegger shifted uneasily in his chair, finally looking up at her with eyes full of worry and something like regret. After the lawyer left, the manager rubbed his forehead and sighed, suddenly looking older than he had the day before. He explained in hesitant phrases that Mr. Hale was a very important client, that the restaurant depended on people like him, that the owners were furious about what they called a scene. Clara listened, her hands folded in her lap, as he circled and circled around the same point. At last, he told her she would be suspended for the rest of the holiday week to let things cool down, and that they would reassess her position after that. The word reassess rang in her ears like a door creaking on its hinges, not yet closed but not welcoming either. Out on the street again, in the thin winter sunlight, the city seemed almost indifferent to her private storm. Shoppers rushed past with bags and ribbons, car horns punctuated the air, and somewhere a street musician played a shaky version of Silent Night on a trumpet. Clara walked slowly, her work shoes slapping against the pavement, feeling both too light, suddenly unmoored from her routine, and unbearably heavy with the knowledge that every lost shift meant less money, fewer chances to keep up with bills. At home, she opened her small metal box of savings and counted the crumpled notes and coins, her fingers moving mechanically while her mind replayed the lawyer's warning about consequences. The amount looked smaller than ever beneath the kitchen's harsh yellow light. Sitting at the table, she took a deep breath and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she hadn't dialed in years. Donna Helena, a longtime friend of her mother, who had once lived in the same building. The older woman's voice came through the line, warm and surprised, tinged with the rustle of a television in the background. When Clara mentioned the ring, there was a pause, then a soft sigh, as if some old sadness had been stirred awake. Helena remembered the day her mother went to the pawnshop, remembered how her hands shook when she came back without the ring, and remembered the name scrawled on the receipt that she had once seen by accident. She thought the shop still existed, though she hadn't passed by in a long time. Later that afternoon, Clara took a bus to the old neighborhood, watching the streets grow more familiar, more worn, as they left the glittering center behind. She found the pawn shop on a corner that smelled of engine oil and fried food, its metal shutter pulled halfway down, the old painted sign fading under years of weather. A smaller, newer plaque beside the door bore the name of a financial company she didn't recognize, followed by the words, "property of," and a holding group she had never heard of. Through the dusty glass, she could see empty display cases and overturned stools, like a stage after the audience had long gone home. A paper taped crookedly to the inside read, "Closed, under new ownership." Clara pressed her hand against the cold glass and felt the first real sting of this new wound. The past had not only taken from her family, it had been bought, packaged, and quietly erased by people who never even learned their names. High above the city, in a penthouse where the windows stretched from floor to ceiling, Victor Hale stood with his back to the view, a glass of amber liquid warming his hand. The lights below flickered like a field of distant stars, but he wasn't really seeing them. On a small table near the leather armchair lay his phone, still buzzing now and then with messages from associates, journalists, and board members who had heard whispers about an incident. He ignored them all, his gaze fixed instead on his own left hand. The ring, usually just another part of his daily armor, seemed tonight to burn against his skin. He sat down heavily and slowly pulled the ring off, turning it between his fingers as if examining a piece of evidence rather than a cherished object. The engraving caught the lamplight in familiar patterns, delicate leaves circling a thin band of gold, every curve and groove worn smooth by years on another person's hand before his. He remembered the first time he'd seen it, not on a woman's finger, but in a small velvet tray laid out on a cheap counter in a cramped office. A man from his team had presented it along with several documents, saying quietly that the matter would be taken care of. Victor had not asked too many questions. Successful men, he believed, did not waste time on the details of what had to be buried. His wife appeared at the doorway of the study, hair brushed back, a silk robe tied neatly at the waist, a soft frown on her face. "You've been in here for hours," she said gently. "The dinner went well, didn't it? The charity people were thrilled." Victor forced a small smile, took a sip of his drink, and muttered something about being tired, about one of the staff overstepping. He did not mention the girl's eyes, or the tremor in her voice when she spoke of her mother, or the sharp flash of recognition that had leapt in his chest uninvited. His wife lingered a moment, sensing there was more, but years of living in his orbit had taught her when not to push. When she left, closing the door with a soft click, the room seemed to grow quieter, the ticking clock on the wall suddenly too loud. Victor set the glass down and opened a locked drawer in his desk, pulling out a slim, dusty folder he hadn't touched in a very long time. Inside were copies of incident reports, legal opinions, and settlement proposals from a construction site whose name he barely remembered saying out loud. One page bore a photograph, a man in a hard hat, smiling awkwardly at the camera, his arm around a woman with tired eyes. Teman's name meant little to him now, just another entry in an old ledger, but the surname caught his attention. Alvarez. He closed the folder quickly, as if the very air around it had become too heavy, and shoved it back into the drawer, locking it with more force than necessary. Standing again, he slipped the ring back onto his finger almost angrily, as though determined to make it obey his will, to turn it back into a simple ornament instead of a question. Pride rose in his chest like a shield, telling him he had built hospitals, funded schools, employed thousands, done more good than harm in the grand balance of things. Yet beneath that familiar armor, a quieter voice whispered that no amount of charitable giving could erase the way the girl had looked at him, as if she could see through the polished glass of his life to the one crack he had never really sealed. The week of suspension passed like a slow, cold fog, each day blurring into the next, as Clara checked her phone for messages that never came. On the morning she was told to come in to discuss her position, she ironed her uniform carefully, smoothing every wrinkle as if that could erase the stain of what had happened. The subway ride felt longer than usual, every stop announced in a voice that sounded oddly distant. When she stepped into the staff entrance, the familiar mix of coffee, cleaning chemicals, and kitchen spices washed over her, but there was no comfort in it this time. Her chest tightened with the sense that something was already decided, long before she arrived. The manager was waiting in the office, a folder on his desk, his eyes already apologizing before his mouth formed the words. He invited her to sit, but she remained standing for a moment, bracing herself with one hand on the back of the chair. He spoke in soft, rehearsed phrases about brand protection and upscale clientele, about how the owners felt they could not risk upsetting someone as influential as Mr. Hale. Each sentence felt like it was being read from a script written by people who had never once worn a name tag. When he finally said, "We're going to have to let you go," the words landed with a dull, heavy thud that seemed to knock the air out of the room. She signed the exit forms with hands that felt oddly separate from her body, watching her own name appear on the lines in shaky ink. There was mention of her previously positive performance, a reminder that this wasn't personal, just circumstantial, as if losing her income at Christmas were an unfortunate weather event no one could help. He offered a weak smile and said she could list him as a reference, that he'd say good things, as if kindness could plug the hole opening in her life. When she stepped out of the office, a few co-workers pretended not to see the small cardboard box in her arms, while others gave her quick hugs and whispered, "I'm so sorry," before hurrying away, scared of being seen standing still. Outside, the winter sky hung low and grey, the kind of day that seemed undecided between rain and snow. Clara walked slowly down the block, her box of belongings feeling heavier than any tray she had ever carried. Through the restaurant's front windows, she could see new guests being seated, napkins unfolding, glasses sparkling, the world inside already rearranged to cover the space she used to occupy. She thought of the rent due in 2 weeks, of the bills she'd been putting off, of the envelope of crumpled cash that would now empty faster than ever. For a moment, she wondered if she should have just signed the paper, swallowed her doubt, and let the truth sink quietly into the dark. That evening, as shadows stretched long over the sidewalks, she found herself back in front of the old pawnshop, almost without realizing she'd walked there. The shutter was still pulled down, the sign still faded, the words, "Under new ownership," still crooked in the window. She stood staring at her own faint reflection in the glass, feeling a strange ache in her chest, a mix of anger and helpless longing for something she could never quite reach. She had just turned to leave, ready to accept that the past had locked its doors to her, when a side door creaked open and an elderly man stepped out, fumbling with a set of keys. He looked up, squinted at her face, then at the name tag still pinned to her coat, and his expression changed. Recognition, surprise, and a flicker of guilt all crossing his features at once as he whispered, "Alvarez, you're her daughter, aren't you?" For a moment, Clara could only stare at him, the sounds of the street fading into a muffled blur as his words settled over her. "You look just like her," the old man added, his voice roughened by age and something like remorse. He glanced nervously up and down the sidewalk, then stepped aside and gestured toward the half-open side door. "Come in, dear. We shouldn't talk out here." A faint smell of dust and metal drifted from inside, the ghost of years of traded treasures and desperate bargains. Clutching her box a little tighter, Clara followed him into the dim corridor, feeling as if she were walking back in time. The back room was smaller than she expected, crowded with shelves and old display stands, everything coated in a fine layer of grey. A single lamp on a metal desk cast a yellow circle of light, leaving the corners in soft shadow. The old man, he introduced himself as Señor Batista, set a chipped mug of tea in front of her and sat down slowly, rubbing his knees as if they hurt. For a moment he just looked at her, eyes travelling over her face with a kind of sad curiosity, as if trying to find traces of a woman he hadn't seen in years. "Your mother. She was a proud woman," he began quietly, "even when life tried to crush her." He spoke in fragments, as if every memory had to be coaxed out of a locked drawer. Yes, he remembered the ring. Gold, delicate with a leaf pattern. Yes, he remembered the day her mother came in with eyes rimmed in red, holding it like it was a piece of her own heart. He remembered how long she stood at the counter, staring at it before letting go, asking 3 times if there was any other way. "I told her I'd keep it safe," he said, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I promised she could buy it back when things got better." But things didn't get better, and one day a man in a dark suit came with paperwork, a company name, and a quiet request to buy a small list of items, including that ring. When Clara pressed for more, who the man was, what company he represented, Batista frowned, rubbing his temple as if the exact details hurt to retrieve. He remembered the name of the holding company vaguely, something that sounded cold and official, but not the man's face clearly. "All I know," he murmured, "is that he paid in cash and wanted no record anyone could see, said it was for closure." He admitted he had felt uneasy, but the shop had been struggling, and the offer had come at just the right moment to keep his doors open a little longer. "I told myself it was just business," he whispered, the words heavy with years of regret. "But some things don't stay in the past, do they?" Later, in her small apartment, the shadows seemed longer than usual, stretching across the floor like questions without answers. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, shoes still on, staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling as the silence wrapped around her shoulders. It would be so easy, she thought, to stop here, to say that the ring was gone, that her job was gone, that chasing the truth had only cost her more than she could afford. She picked up her father's worn work jacket from the back of the chair and pressed it to her chest, breathing in the faint, lingering scent of old fabric and memory. With her eyes closed, she whispered a halting prayer into the darkness, not asking for revenge or miracles, only for a sign that she wasn't completely lost in this maze of grief and doubt. And for the first time, she wondered if anyone, on earth or heaven, was really listening. The next morning, Clara woke to the grey light of winter seeping around the edges of the curtain, her head heavy from a night of fragmented sleep. For a few seconds, she lay still, caught between dream and memory, until the image of the pawnshop and Senor Batista's lined face floated back into her thoughts. Doubt was still there, curled up in her chest like a stone, but it no longer sat alone. Beside it, something smaller and warmer flickered, refusing to be snuffed out. She dragged herself from bed, made a cup of instant coffee, and sat at the table staring at the old box of papers, wondering if it held anything the old man's memories had missed. Her phone vibrated suddenly against the tabletop, the sound startling in the quiet room. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, yet the area code tugged at recognition from another life. When she answered, the voice on the other end was raspy but clear. Senor Batista, sounding more awake and urgent than he had the night before. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted without preamble. "That ring, your mother, the man in the suit, it all kept turning in my head." He said that after she left, he had gone digging through boxes in the back room, chasing a memory he thought he'd lost. Somewhere within the mess, he had found an old metal tin. Inside, among dead pens and receipts, lay a thin stack of yellowed slips. He described the paper he had pulled from the pile, an original pawn receipt with her mother's name and the details of the ring written in faded ink, and on the back a stamped note he hadn't seen in years. "Item transferred per request," it read, followed by the name of a holding company, Sterling Ridge Investments, and a reference code. That was it, he told her, frustration and triumph mingling in his voice. "That's the name I couldn't remember last night." He admitted he had kept a few old records out of stubbornness when the shop changed hands, even though he was supposed to destroy them. "Maybe some part of me knew they'd matter to someone someday," he said softly. Clara wrote the name down on the back of an envelope, her hand steady for the first time in days. The words looked clinical and harmless, the kind of company that could be anything from a loan office to a shell for something much larger. When Batista added that the man who bought the ring had carried a business card with the same logo, just a silver crest, and that name, her mind immediately jumped to the folders and logos she'd seen on news reports about Victor Hale's empire. Different branches, different fronts, all feeding the same towering structure. "If you come by later, I'll give you the receipt," he promised. "It's not much, but it's a thread, and threads can become ropes." When the call ended, Clara sat for a long moment, the envelope still in her hand, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the traffic outside. For the first time since she had lost her job, the world did not feel entirely closed to her. A narrow door had appeared in the wall, not yet open, but unmistakably there. She pulled her laptop closer and typed the name Sterling Ridge Investments into the search bar, watching as page after page appeared with small print mentioning subsidiaries, construction partnerships, and again, Hale Consolidated. The ring, the pawnshop, her father's death, they were no longer scattered, lonely points in her memory. They were beginning to connect into a line, and that simple, fragile line was enough to make her heart beat faster with a cautious, stubborn hope that refused, this time, to die. Sterling Ridge Investments turned out not to be a place with a front door and a sign, but a tangle of addresses and small print mentions buried in financial documents. As Clara scrolled through page after page of search results, the same pattern emerged, a quiet company tucked behind louder names, always linked in some way to Hale Consolidated. Sometimes it acquired assets, sometimes it managed risk, sometimes it facilitated transfers, but it never stood alone. Each new connection tightened the knot in her stomach and at the same time sharpened her focus. The ring had not just fallen into Victor Hale's hand by chance. It had been routed, like everything else in his world, through carefully designed channels. The next step led her away from glowing screens and into fluorescent-lit corridors at the city records office. The building smelled faintly of paper, dust, and tired coffee, its walls lined with bulletin boards and faded notices. A clerk with kind eyes and ink-stained fingers helped her look up the construction site where her father had died, clicking through old databases and disappearing into the back to fetch files from storage. Clara sat at a metal table under harsh lighting, fingers laced together, listening to the shuffle of distant drawers opening and closing, as if old secrets were being dragged reluctantly into the present. When the clerk finally returned, he laid a thick folder in front of her, its edges worn and soft from years of handling. Inside, she found photocopied blueprints, safety reports, and typed incident logs that tried to reduce human lives to checkboxes and numbers. One report, dated just weeks before her father's death, mentioned a formal complaint about unstable scaffolding and missing protective equipment. The name on the complaint form made her breath hitch. Alvarez, signed in her father's cramped handwriting. Below it, in a different pen, someone had scribbled, "Addressed. No further action required." Another page mentioned Sterling Ridge as a partner in risk management, its role described in such vague terms it might have meant anything or nothing. Clara traced the letters of her father's name with the tip of her finger, feeling both pride and a sharp, new anger that he had tried to be heard and been quietly filed away. She made copies of everything the clerk allowed, feeding pages one by one into the whirring machine until she had a neat stack of documents tucked into a cheap plastic folder. Walking out into the cold air, the sky pale and thin above the city, she felt an odd mixture of heaviness and relief. The papers under her arm did not shout, but they spoke, softly, stubbornly, of warnings ignored and lives treated as acceptable losses. Each step away from the records office felt like a step closer to something she couldn't yet see clearly. Not just personal closure, but a crack in the carefully polished image of a man the world called a visionary. As she crossed the street, her thoughts buried in the words she had just read, a shape lingering by a bus stop caught the edge of her vision. A man in a dark coat stood with his hands in his pockets, pretending to study the timetable, though no buses were due for a while. When she glanced his way, he looked up too quickly, then away again, but not before she caught the flicker of recognition in his eyes, like someone who had been looking for her and had finally found his mark. A few minutes later, as she turned down another block, she heard the faint buzz of a phone behind her and a low voice saying, "Yes, it's her. She's got the files." The words slid down her spine like ice, making it clear that she was no longer the only one following the trail her father had left behind. Clara's pace quickened as she turned the next corner. The folder clutched tighter against her chest, the air suddenly colder against her face. She told herself she was imagining things, that the man by the bus stop had been just another passerby, but the rhythm of footsteps behind her did not fade. When she crossed the street without looking back, the steps crossed too, matching her distance with unnerving precision. Her heart hammered in her ears, drowning out the city noise, until finally she stopped beside a closed bakery and turned around, ready to confront whoever had decided she was worth following. The man in the dark coat halted a few yards away, hands raised slightly to show they were empty, his eyes cautious but not hostile. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said quickly, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Up close, Clara could see the lines around his eyes, the weariness of someone older than his neatly trimmed beard suggested. "I just didn't know how else to approach you without scaring you." She narrowed her eyes, every muscle tense, her grip on the folder tightening. "You're doing a great job so far," she replied, the sarcasm thin but sharp. "Who are you, and why do you know I have the files?" The man glanced around, as if measuring how many strangers might be listening, then nodded toward a nearby cafe with fogged-up windows and a nearly empty interior. "Please," he said quietly, "just give me 10 minutes. After that, if you want me to disappear, I will." Inside the cafe, beneath the hum of a refrigerator and the clink of cups, he gave her a name, Daniel Reed, and a past that sounded like something pulled from a forgotten drawer, just like her father's file. He had worked for Hale Consolidated for nearly a decade, he explained, first as an assistant to one of the senior executives, and then as a kind of fixer for sensitive situations. Sterling Ridge Investments had been one of his main responsibilities, a shell within the larger shell, designed to absorb problems before they could reach the polished surface of Victor Hale's public image. "I was the one they sent when something needed to disappear quietly," he said, his eyes fixed on the coffee he wasn't drinking. People, complaints, objects. When she asked about the ring, his shoulders sagged, as if a weight he'd carried alone for years had finally been named. Yes, he remembered the pawnshop. Yes, he remembered the woman who had pawned the ring. He remembered the order that came down from above: retrieve a list of items connected to a particular accident, pay generously, leave no trace. "I was told it was part of a settlement," he said, voice low, "that the widow was being taken care of, that the ring would just be a symbol of closure. But when I checked the records later, there was no payment registered in her name. It was like she never existed." Clara felt her stomach twist as the cafe around them blurred. The life her mother had scraped together alone had never included that promised relief. Daniel admitted that his questions had not been appreciated. Within months, he had been phased out of the company, his loyalty questioned, his future quietly blocked in places where Victor's influence ran deep. Still, before he left, he had copied what he could: emails, internal memos, signed authorizations. From his worn messenger bag, he pulled a thin folder and slid it across the small table toward her. Inside, Clara saw printouts of internal correspondence referring to the accident by a project code, casual discussions of acceptable loss, and a directive bearing Victor Hale's digital signature instructing Sterling Ridge to resolve outstanding liabilities discreetly. At the bottom, in smaller text, was a list of items to be retrieved, including one described simply as gold ring leaf engraving. "You need to understand," Daniel said softly, his gaze meeting hers for the first time. "Once you step fully into this, you can't just walk away. He has spent a lifetime building walls between himself and the consequences of his decisions. People who push against those walls rarely come out unchanged." Clara looked from the folder in her hands to the fear and resolve in his face, feeling the weight of everything pressing in. Her father's unanswered complaint, her mother's bare finger, her own lost job, and now this man who had paid for asking too many questions. Outside, snow had begun to fall in thin, hesitant flakes against the cafe window, as if the world were holding its breath. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear, a stubborn flame answered. Still, as she closed the folder with trembling fingers, one question rose above all the others, sharp and inescapable. Now that she held proof that touched the very heart of Victor Hale's empire, how far was she truly willing to go, and what, or whom, might this truth cost her next? The plan, when it finally took shape, didn't feel like a plan so much as a last resort. Daniel showed her the invitation he had received from an old contact, a public event where Victor Hale would unveil a new philanthropic initiative, a foundation meant to honor workers and their families. The irony made Clara's throat tighten, but it also carved a path she could follow. The event would be open to the press, full of cameras and microphones, a place where carefully scripted words ruled the room. If she wanted to pierce his armor, she would have to do it there, under lights he couldn't switch off. For 2 nights she barely slept, memorizing documents, rehearsing questions, hearing her father's name over and over in her mind, like a quiet drumbeat. The day of the event, the hotel ballroom buzzed with polite excitement, chandeliers spilling warm light over rows of chairs, and a stage dressed in banners bearing Victor's name and the foundation's logo. Clara sat among journalists and donors, her cheap blazer feeling like cardboard on her shoulders, the folder of copies resting on her lap like a live coal. Daniel sat a few rows behind her, close enough to watch, far enough to vanish if things went wrong. On the stage, a moderator spoke in glowing terms about Victor's vision, his commitment to safety, his legacy of responsibility. Every phrase felt like a stone being stacked on top of the truth she carried, trying to bury it before it ever saw daylight. When Victor finally stepped up to the podium, the room broke into practiced applause. He smiled, the familiar, polished expression that had charmed boardrooms and camera crews for decades. He spoke of his humble beginnings, his respect for the workers who built this city with their hands, his desire to give back. Clara felt her fingers dig into the edges of the folder, her pulse thudding in her ears. To anyone else, he looked every bit the generous patriarch, his voice smooth and sincere. But she saw the man from the restaurant, hand jerking back from her question, eyes flashing with something colder and sharper than the lights above him. When the speech ended, the moderator announced a brief question-and-answer period. Hands shot up, reporters asking about tax structures, future projects, partnerships. Clara waited, the beating in her chest so loud she wondered if others could hear it. Then, as the moderator scanned the room again, her own hand rose, almost on its own, steady despite the tremor in her body. "Yes, you in the blue jacket," he said, gesturing toward her. She stood slowly, every movement feeling both fragile and irreversible, and spoke her name into the small microphone being passed down the row. "Clara Alvarez," she said, hearing her father's surname ring out in the hall. Her voice shook on the first word, but steadied as she went on. "Mr. Hale, you spoke about honoring workers and their families," she began, her gaze locked on his. "Do you remember a man named Miguel Alvarez? He died on one of your construction sites after filing a formal complaint that was marked addressed and ignored." A murmur rippled through the room. Victor's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, then returned, thinner now. Clara stepped into the aisle and walked toward the stage, the folder pressed to her chest, her words gaining strength with each step. "Do you remember the ring taken from his widow and quietly purchased through Sterling Ridge Investments?" she asked, stopping at the foot of the platform. She opened the folder, lifting out copies of the documents and holding them up so the nearest cameras could zoom in. "Because I have your signatures, your emails, and the list where my family's grief was reduced to a line item called liability." Flashbulbs exploded. Reporters leaned forward, and for the first time, Victor's carefully controlled expression slipped, a crack of raw shock running through his composure as the room turned, hungry, to hear what he could possibly say next. For a long moment, no one breathed. Victor stood motionless at the podium, eyes fixed on the papers in Clara's raised hand, the words liability and Alvarez, now projected on screens around the room by eager camera crews. The moderator tried to smooth his expression into neutrality, but his knuckles whitened on the microphone. "Mr. Hale, would you like to respond?" he asked, voice a shade too high. Victor cleared his throat, reaching instinctively for the familiar shield of indignation. "These are misinterpretations," he began, but the confidence in his tone rang thinner than it ever had before. A reporter in the front row stood up, waving a press badge. "Sir, are these your emails?" she called out, her voice cutting through the murmur. "Is that your directive to resolve liabilities discreetly after a worker's death?" Another journalist followed, asking about Sterling Ridge and its role in absorbing problems for Hale Consolidated. Questions began to pile on top of each other, the polite order of the event dissolving into a rising tide of voices. Clara lowered the papers just enough to meet Victor's eyes. In them, she saw not the invincible titan from the financial magazines, but a man calculating fast how much truth he could afford to admit without watching everything collapse. From the side of the room, Daniel stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. He raised his hand and spoke into the nearest microphone, identifying himself and his former position. "I can confirm the authenticity of those documents," he said, his voice shaking but clear. "I was instructed to retrieve Mrs. Alvarez's ring from a pawnshop, along with other items, under the pretense of a settlement that was never actually paid. I questioned the process. Shortly after that, my position was eliminated." A collective gasp rolled through the room, the story no longer just Clara's grief, but evidence of a pattern. Phones went up like a small forest, recording every word, sending them out beyond the walls of the ballroom. Victor's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly, as if something inside him had finally slipped from his grasp. He looked at Clara again, really looked, seeing not an annoying waitress, but the living echo of a man whose name had once been nothing more than a file in a drawer. "Mistakes were made," he said at last, his voice lower, his public mask cracked but not fully fallen. "Some complaints, like Mr. Alvarez's, were not handled as they should have been. I trusted others to manage those matters, and I failed to ensure they were treated with the respect they deserved." It was not a full confession, but it was no longer a denial either. The room pressed in around him, every eye weighing those words, judging the gap between what he admitted and what everyone suspected. He announced, under the glare of cameras, that an independent investigation would be launched, that any families wronged by his company would be contacted, that compensation and public acknowledgement would be offered. "And if that investigation finds me personally responsible," he added, surprising even himself, "I will step aside from my role." The board, watching from reserved seats, exchanged alarmed glances, already thinking of damage control and succession plans. As the scene fractured into shouted questions and flashing bulbs, Clara stepped back, the folder suddenly feeling lighter in her hands. This wasn't perfect justice, not yet, but the truth, long buried, was no longer locked in drawers and whispered regrets. It had stepped into the light, and there was no graceful way for anyone, not even Victor Hale, to pretend it hadn't been seen. Yet as she slipped out a side exit, heart pounding, one quiet doubt followed her into the cold air. When the noise died down and the headlines faded, would that light be enough to heal the wound her family had carried for so many years? The days after the confrontation unfolded like the slow receding of a storm, not with sudden silence, but with echo after echo rolling across the city. On the news, Victor's face no longer appeared beside rising stock charts and philanthropic headlines, but framed by words like investigation, wrongful death, and concealed settlements. Talk shows replayed Clara's question, and the moment his composure cracked, dissecting every flicker in his expression as if truth could be measured in pixels. In her small apartment, the television's glow washed over the same worn furniture that had witnessed years of quiet struggle. But now her father's name was spoken out loud in living rooms far beyond her own. For the first time, his story existed somewhere other than in her mother's tired voice and a dusty box of papers. Letters began to arrive in plain envelopes that felt heavier than their size, bearing the seals of commissions and law firms she had never imagined would know her family's name. The independent review confirmed what the documents had already whispered: safety warnings ignored, complaints buried, lives reduced to numbers in cost analyses. One cold morning, an envelope thicker than the rest slid under her door and landed with a soft, solid thud. Inside, formal language acknowledged avoidable risk and institutional negligence, offering financial compensation and a public statement of responsibility for Miguel Alvarez's death. Clara read every line slowly, her thumb pressing into the paper as if to make sure it was real, feeling anger and relief and grief braid together into something too complex to name. At the bottom of the packet, taped separately, was a small, dark box with no logo, only her name handwritten in careful, slightly shaky letters. Her breath caught as she lifted the lid. There, nestled in velvet like something fragile, finally allowed to rest, lay the ring, the leaf-engraved band she had known all her life only through memory and her mother's careful description. The gold was polished now, but the tiny worn place on the edge remained, proof that time and hands had passed over it again and again. Underneath it, on a folded card, were a few spare sentences in Victor's uneven script. No justifications, no grand speeches, only an admission that he had kept the ring as a reminder of what he chose not to face, and that returning it was the least he owed to the man whose life had been treated as expendable. A bare winter sky hung low over the cemetery the day she went to see her father, the air sharp enough to sting her lungs with every breath. The ground was hard beneath her feet, the grass brittle and pale, and the names on the stones seemed to lean toward her as she walked the narrow path. At his grave she knelt, brushing away a few dead leaves that had gathered along the base of the headstone, tracing the letters of his name, the way she once traced her spelling lessons as a child. From her pocket she drew the ring, its metal warming slowly against her skin, and after a long, quiet moment she threaded it onto a thin silver chain and fastened it around her neck. The weight was barely there, but she felt it distinctly, as if something that had always been missing in her life had finally found its way home. Only when she rose did she sense she was no longer alone. A man stood several yards away on the path, hat in his hands, shoulders slightly bowed, as if the cold pressed down harder on him than on the bare trees. Even at a distance, Clara recognized the profile she had seen in newspapers and across crowded rooms, now stripped of cameras and applause. Victor Hale, his expensive coat looking oddly plain against the grey sky, a small bouquet of white flowers trembling just slightly in his grip. His gaze flicked to the chain at her throat and then back to her face, uncertainty written in every line of his posture. For a moment, the wind seemed to hold its breath between them, the whole past balanced on the narrow space separating two lives. Clara's fingers rose instinctively to touch the ring over her heart as she wondered, with a tight, aching question, whether she could take even one step toward the man whose choices had shattered her family, and what it would mean for her soul if she did. Clara did not move at first, the cold pressed against her boots, the ring resting like a small sun beneath her fingertips, and the years of anger and loneliness rose in her throat like a tide. Then very slowly, she drew in a breath that felt deeper than any she had taken in a long time, and took one step forward, then another. Victor's eyes flickered with surprise and something like fear, as if he had never quite believed she would choose to close the distance. When they stood a few paces apart, the flowers in his hands seemed almost shy, out of place in fingers more used to signing contracts than offering apologies. The wind tugged at his coat and her scarf, carrying away the words neither of them yet knew how to say. "I didn't come to ask you for anything," she said softly, breaking the silence first, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I came to bring him back his name." Victor swallowed, gaze dropping briefly to the headstone, then to the ring at her chest. He told her that the investigation had done what it could. Compensation paid, procedures overhauled, names cleared in reports that once called accidents unavoidable. He spoke of stepping down from his company, of watching others assume the power he had once gripped so tightly, of waking each morning with the uncomfortable freedom of a man who could no longer pretend he'd done no harm. "There's no balance sheet that makes this right," he admitted quietly. "But I wanted you to know I understand that now." They stood together in a silence that was strangely gentle, not empty, but full of what had finally been spoken. Clara told him without bitterness about the nights her mother paced the kitchen with bills spread across the table, about the Christmases where absence sat in the chair that once belonged to her father. She described how long it had taken to realize that her pain was not weakness, but proof of a love that had been real and deep. Victor listened without interruption, his jaw tight, eyes shining with a tired grief that seemed to reach beyond this one grave. When she finished, she did not say, "I forgive you," in any grand, dramatic way. Instead, she simply added, "I'm choosing not to carry you with me as my enemy anymore." And for him, it felt like the most generous mercy he could ever have hoped to receive. Time moved on, as it always does, but it no longer dragged her father's memory behind it like a weight. Clara used part of the settlement to enroll in evening classes, sitting in crowded classrooms with younger students, learning the language of regulations, safety standards, and workers' rights. By day, she joined a small organization that helped injured workers and grieving families navigate the same maze that had once swallowed her mother. She found herself at kitchen tables, much like the one she had grown up around, explaining forms patiently, listening to stories of fear and confusion, and feeling each time that she was placing another small stone on the side of the scale her father had tried to tip toward justice. On her desk, the photo of Miguel and her mother at the construction site watched over her, his smile no longer a reminder of what might have been, but a quiet blessing on what she was becoming. The ring remained on its chain, resting over her heart through long days and quiet nights, no longer a relic of loss, but a living symbol of a story that had refused to stay buried. On future Christmas Eves, when city lights blinked against frosted windows and carols floated through the air, she would pause for a moment, fingers brushing the cool metal, and think of how far that small circle of gold had travelled, from love to desperation, from greed to confession, from silence into the light. Somewhere, perhaps at another cemetery, or in a modest office where no cameras waited, Victor continued his own slow work of reckoning, far from the headlines that once celebrated him. Their paths crossed only rarely, but they no longer needed to. What mattered had already been said where it counted most, and if this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption.